Well, hello and welcome back to Through the Bible. This is episode 11, and we are going to be talking about a really interesting story in the Old Testament in the book of Numbers, the story of Balaam. And what we learn in this story is that nothing can stop God from blessing his people. Now, this is a really unique story about a very famous wizard, a magician in the Old Testament, the guy by the name of Balaam. Now, when I was a teenager, this was before the Marvel franchise really took off, and so one of the more popular movie series, one of the more popular franchises when I was in high school was Harry Potter. And Harry Potter is still popular today. Over 500 million books have been sold. The franchise is worth $25 billion. And so you could say that Harry Potter is the most famous wizard in the world. What we're going to be talking about with the story of Balaam is kind of like an ancient Harry Potter. He was world renowned. He was renowned as a seer and as a prophet and as a magician who could actually affect the fate of nations with his blessing or his curse. And so at this point, the story of Israel, they are wandering through the wilderness. And so they tried to go into the promised land. They got afraid. They did not trust God, and God sent them wandering in the wilderness for a generation because they would not let him take them into the promised land and give them the victory that he had promised them. And so they're at their last stop. They're in the plains of Moab. And even in the wilderness, even though they've been wandering in the wilderness, they've seen victory after victory, provision after provision. God has taken such good care of them even while they've been wandering. They never wanted for food. Their shoes and their clothes never wore out miraculously. And they have been conquering nations along the way. Even though there are people with no set military, they don't even have city walls, they don't have a capital, they don't even have a temple. They had a tabernacle, as we talked about last time. It was a tent where they met with God. And yet God has given them victory after victory. And so Balak was the king of Moab, the place where the Israelites were, and Balak is afraid of the Israelites. And so Balak sends truckloads of money to try to hire this ancient Harry Potter, to hire this magician Balaam to come and curse the nation of Israel for him. And so who is Balaam? What is up with Balaam? He's this ancient magician. These people come, these delegates from Balak come with these truckloads of money to try to bribe him, to pay him to come curse the nation of Israel. But God shows up to Balaam. God shows up to him, speaks to him, and he says in Numbers chapter 22, verses 12 and 13, he says, "You shall not go with them. You shall not curse the people, for they are blessed." And so Balaam initially turns these guys away, but then really tries to talk God into letting him go. And so God does let him go, does let Balaam go, but he is only going to allow Balaam to say the things that God himself will speak. And so the way that he gets there is really interesting. And so Balaam is riding on a donkey. And this is a very bizarre story in the book of Numbers, chapter 22. Balaam is riding on his donkey, and all of a sudden, an angel with a flaming sword appears in front of Balaam's donkey. And so Balaam's donkey stops, gets terrified, tries to throw Balaam off. And Balaam beats his donkey. He doesn't see the angel. And then the donkey grinds Balaam's foot into the wall to try to go to the right and stay away from this terrifying angel with the flaming sword. And finally, Balaam, after beating this donkey again and again, it says that this in verse 38 of chapter 22. It says, "When the donkey saw the angel of the Lord, she finally lay down under Balaam. Balaam's anger was kindled, and he struck the donkey. Then the Lord opened the mouth of the donkey, and she said to Balaam, 'What have I done to you that you've struck me these 3 times?' And Balaam said to the donkey, 'Because you have made a fool of me. I wish I had a sword in my hand, for then I would kill you.' And the donkey said, 'Am I not your donkey, on which you have ridden all your life long to this day? Is it my habit to treat you this way?' And he said, 'No.' Then the Lord opened the eyes of Balaam. He saw the angel of the Lord standing in the way with his drawn sword in his hand, and he bowed down and fell on his face." And so I think it's hilarious that Balaam is not thrown off by the fact that his donkey is talking to him, number one. Number two, this interaction actually shows us a couple things that we can learn from Balaam. Balaam, he appears to be righteous. He appears to be holy. He's going to go and he's going to bless Israel. He says, I can only do what the Lord has told me to do. But we see both through this narrative and in the New Testament, actually in the book of 2 Peter, Peter tells us that Balaam was nothing more than a false teacher who knew the right words to say. But in the end, it says he loved, quote, gain from wrongdoing. And the angel speaks to Balaam. God speaks to Balaam and says that his mission is perverse madness, is the phrase that he uses. And so the character of Balaam serves as a warning to us. And so one thing that this tells us is this. Number one, spiritual gifting is not a sign of spiritual maturity, or in this case, even of salvation. Someone can be very high on spiritual gifting and very low on character. And so the Spirit came on Balaam. The Spirit empowered Balaam to say these things. He had the gifts, but he didn't have the grace. And so when we are looking to Christian leaders and when we are looking in ourselves, do not choose gifts over grace. If there is not the fruit of the Spirit present in the life of a leader, if there's not the fruit of the Spirit present in your life, it does not matter how capable you are. It doesn't matter how charismatic you are. It doesn't matter how good of a Bible teacher you are if the grace of God is not there. And so this story is a warning. It's also an encouragement. It's an encouragement in two ways. Number one, God can use even corrupt characters to accomplish his purpose. And so maybe you have been concerned about what you see in culture. Maybe you're concerned with what you see in the government or in politics, but God can use even corrupt characters to accomplish his purpose. There is no panic in the Godhead. They are not calling emergency meetings. God's purposes are never thwarted. He uses even corrupt characters to accomplish what he wants to accomplish. And then lastly, an encouragement. If God can use not just corrupt characters, but if God can use someone as dumb as a donkey, he can use me too. And so even if you are thick-headed, even if you feel like you are not capable, God can use you in powerful ways. If he can speak through a donkey, he can speak through me, and he can speak through you as well. And so that's what we see from the character of Balaam. But we see some other things here, not just about the character of Balaam, but we see things about the character of God. And so Numbers 23, as we move through the narrative here, is a very long narrative in the Old Testament, which is why we're focusing on it, even though it's such a unique story. 23 verses 7 and 8. This is the first prophecy that Balaam gives to the nation of Israel. It says, Balaam took up discourse, and he says, from a wrong, Balak has brought me, the king of Moab from the eastern mountains. Come, curse Jacob for me, and come denounce Israel. But how can I curse whom God has not cursed? How can I denounce whom the Lord has not denounced? And so what we see is that, number one, God protects his people. They have been in the desert for 40 years. As we said earlier, no military, no city, no nothing, and yet God has protected them. He's protected them from corruption on the inside, and he's protected them from opposition from the outside as well. And so God is with them. And so you see this in verses 21 through 23 as well, where it says this. It says, he has not beheld misfortune in Jacob, nor has he seen trouble in Israel, because the Lord their God is with them. The shout of a king is among them. God brings them out of Egypt, and is for them like the horns of a wild ox. There is no enchantment against Jacob, no divination against Israel. And so God protects his people. And God doesn't just protect the Israelites in the Old Testament, God protects his church. Jesus said that even the gates of hell will not prevail against the church. There is no curse that can come against you. There is no divination. There is nothing that can come against you in Christ, because God is for you and God is the one who protects you. And so we see that God protects his people, number one. Number two, we see that the Lord is unchanging. And so after the first oracle, Balak is not happy with Balaam. And so he says, "What have you done?" He says, "I told you to curse them, but look, you've blessed them." And so he takes him to another spot and says, "Well, maybe the God of Israel will let us curse them from over here." And so he takes him over here. But here's what happens in 19 and 20. It says, "God is not man." This is Balaam's second oracle. He says, "God is not man that he should lie. He is not a son of man that he should change his mind. Has he said, and will he not do it? Or has he spoken, and will he not fulfill it? Behold, I received a command to bless. He has blessed, and I cannot revoke it." Balak and Balaam were trying to treat God like a god for hire. All of the false gods that the Moabites were worshiping, the ancient idols, were capricious. They were bought. If you gave the right sacrifices, they would do things that you might be able to manipulate them into. But even then, they were inconsistent. And so you never really knew what you got. You would have to show up to church on time and give the right sacrifices and pray the right prayers and do the right things. But even then, they could turn on you. But not with God. God does not lie. The true God, the only true God, is unchanging. He's not phased. He does not change his mind. And this is the God that we worship. This is a God that we can rely on because God is faithful. He is always faithful to you. He is always faithful to his people. And so what they are realizing is God is not somebody that they can manipulate to line up with their agenda. Instead, aren't we meant to line up to God's agenda? And so that is the message that he gives us there. Now, the third thing, the final thing, we've seen that God is determined to protect his people. We've seen that he is unchanging. And lastly, God is determined to bless his people at all costs. This whole time, Balaam has been trying to curse God's people, but every time he has blessed them. In Christ, only blessings are what you receive. You do not receive curses. How do we know this? And so look at one of the final blessings that he gives in chapter 24, verse 17. It says this. This is cryptic. This is what Balaam says. He says, "I see him, but not now. I behold him, but not near. A star shall come out of Jacob, and a scepter shall rise out of Israel. It shall crush the forehead of Moab and break down all the sons of Shesh." What is this talking about? What kind of weird cryptic message? Who is this star that rises out of Israel? Who is this scepter that is going to crush the head of Moab? It's not just talking about a military victory. It's talking about a coming king. But this language is far too cosmic to just apply to David or just apply to one of the future Israelite kings. In fact, in Revelation chapter 22, it says that the star that Balaam is referring to here is Jesus. Jesus is the morning star. Jesus is the one who rose out of Israel. Jesus is the one who came with a scepter in his hand. Jesus is the one who is going to make all things right. Jesus is the bright morning star. And so because of that, because of Christ, because of the morning star, we know that when God makes a promise to bless his people, he will fulfill it. And so today, be blessed in this knowledge. Be blessed in Christ.